So we just really want to have a conversation about the topics that have already been raised throughout the morning. So we are very kindly joined by our panellists, who I'll just actually briefly introduce. Larry Murrin probably needs no introduction. He is the CEO of Don Farm Foods and has been since 1985. And obviously, Don Farm Foods have a hugely successful business, global business. So we're absolutely delighted to have Larry here. He has obviously been very prominent in terms of speaking about Brexit, both within the industry and publicly as well in Ireland. We're also joined by Anne Randles. Thank you, Anne, for being here. Anne is the company secretary and is a director at Ornua. And Anne is the group's Brexit task force leader and has held several senior positions across dairy boards and federations, both in Brussels and in Dublin. So we're absolutely delighted to get Anne's insight as well this morning. We're also joined by Libby Carton, and Libby is the co-founder and owner of Kinnegar Brewing, which is a brewery up in Donegal, which I think will show us some very, very unique challenges and insights based on the geography that Libby and her company has in terms of how Brexit is impacting their business, or potential Brexit is impacting their business. And we're also joined by Philip Carroll, who is the chairman of Meat Industry Ireland and former Assistant Secretary General at the Department of Agriculture. So also thank you very much to Philip for being here. So we are going to focus on the topics that Tara went into some level of detail on during her presentation, which were customer relationships, supply chain, customs and controls, financial resilience, and market diversification. One of the pieces of information that Tara put up on one of her slides was 96% of you, 96% of the Brexit Barometer respondents have spoken to their customers about Brexit in the last 3 months, and 79% in the last month. And I think the key topics that were highlighted there were stockholding and customs. So this is something that we saw in Tara's presentation. So I might actually just start with Anne, if that's okay, Anne. Always difficult to go first.
No problem.
But just in terms of Ornua, customer relationships, customer engagement across the UK, what have you found have been the kind of key topics that have come up there?
Okay, so we've obviously been looking at the whole Brexit issue since 2016 now. So, and we have very much followed the lead and guidance from Bord Bia in a lot of that preparatory work, and I think it's important maybe to state that out front in terms of the very procedural and process-based view of looking through all aspects of the business, and from customer relations to supply chain logistics and customs and non-customs barriers. And we have another element there, of course, which is obviously labour availability in the UK because of our UK operations, which would have been very important. And we have a large flow through of labour both ways. And then obviously product diversification and market diversification. So there's sort of the general themes and some strategic issues as well. So they've been sort of the headlines, and they very much mirror what Bord Bia has been doing. So I really would encourage everybody to really follow that. It gives you good discipline in terms of making sure that you have covered off all your aspects. But I think in particular, and we have said this before, and we've gone out and said this before, that the customer relationship piece we have found to be absolutely crucial in terms of preparing ourselves and very much preparing the customer as well for Brexit. And we were probably talking in an empty room to a large extent at the very, very beginning. We went out there from the very start to encourage that engagement piece on Brexit in all of our interfaces with our customers. And it took a while before that and a while could have been 18 months now. Before they really started looking in, and it was maybe 6 months before the first deadline in March of this year, that we started to get that good interaction, that good response back from the customers. But what they're looking for, and what we've found all the time is very much that security of supply, that their supplier, the supplier, and we, Ornua, is prepared for Brexit for them, and that we can give them that reassurance in terms of supply, and we have found that again and again, and that has been the main reassurance that we have had to give them. And obviously giving that reassurance means that we have to be able to back that up and have all of that plans in place, which gets back to the other aspects of your preparedness plan that you have to have there. So that's been very, very important, and we have been actually called out by a number of our major retail customers as being prepared, as a company who really has given them that reassurance and that preparedness, and that's shown that the work that we have been doing has been very, very important. I think there's obviously been a shift, a bit of a hiatus in the last few months. I'm surprised that 75% of people have been in touch on this in the last month, because we have actually maybe found it a tiny bit more of a challenge now to re-engage on that piece. There has been that quietness, but clearly it's very important that we're coming up to October now again. We have seen what's happening in the UK. It's fundamentally important that relationship piece is re-engaged with your customer, that you have that conversation and you have it fast with them. The stockpiling, it's a word which I'm slightly uncomfortable with. I think it's more sort of contingency stocks, and it's really it's what you're doing in order to ensure that you have that, you can meet that customer requirement in terms of security of supply. It's not going to get you, it's not a long-term strategy by any means, but it will hopefully help in terms of the way that we're seeing it, is helping us through that period of disruption as we're going from a transition period, and that's so we have something there in order to buffer our business. But it is very, very important for the short term, but obviously it's not a long-term solution to the problem by any means.
I mean, you mentioned Brexit fatigue there. I think that was a topic that came up during the Minister's presentation as well. Larry, we spoke the other day about this as well, Brexit fatigue, and then you mentioned that you get the sense that it's kind of heating up again now. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, we have to encourage it to heat up again, because the pressure came off after the end of March on the part of our UK associates and customers, and the whole thing about assuring the customer that we have the supply chain covered in all its forms, that we've measured the implications for them and their business, and that we are prepared, because I think that's one of the risks for Ireland. As we have said many times in this room and elsewhere, it's critical that Ireland maintains the confidence and ability to secure the supply chain relationships it has in Britain, notwithstanding Brexit. I'm one of those people that wants Britain to be as important to Ireland as a customer post-Brexit as it is today, and hopefully more so. Now, there's a lot of challenges between now and delivery of that objective, and I recognise that. So we have to make sure that the heat is, not heat, but that the noise is dialed up again, and that the levels of preparedness inside our customers' teams is appropriate to what may happen in October.
Well, you mentioned supply chain there, so I mean, automatically, we were talking about these 5 topics, but they're so hugely interlinked. When you start talking about customer relationships, automatically the conversation shifts to supply chain. And I guess encouragingly, from the Barometer's results today, we've seen 62% moving up to 89% in terms of the number of firms who have actively mapped their supply chain. Now I'd like to bring in Libby here from Kinnegar Brewing in County Donegal. And Libby, maybe you can describe to the room here what unique situation that your company is actually facing in relation to supply chain.
Yeah, well, we have a lot of the issues that all companies have. We have looked at our supply chain in terms of our UK suppliers and have switched almost everything away from the UK. We get, I suppose, one major component, which is our cans, in from a company in Carlisle. Other than that, we're not that reliant on the UK supplier market. But I suppose for us, we have a very different issue, and it's that the land bridge has been mentioned numerous times today, and everyone really thinks of the east-west land bridge. I think in the context of Musgrave, we talked a little bit about the north-south, the south-north land bridge, but not beyond, not over the second border, which is where Donegal, of course, resides. And our biggest problem with Brexit, the biggest challenge, is actually our domestic market. So it's not exporting. We have to send the bulk of our product for our domestic market is actually being sent over two borders to get to our distributor in Dublin. So we're confronted with a situation where our outgoing product is going to be at a competitive disadvantage. All our incoming raw materials, even though we're buying our bottles in Germany and a lot of our malt is coming from Hookhead, places like that, it's all coming over a land bridge to Donegal. And the uncertainty about that, because of the cost implications, I suppose, whether it's time or cost, it's just making things really quite difficult. And our big fear is that in comparison with good colleagues of ours in Ballymote and Sligo, for instance, we all work with the same distributor, we will automatically be at a disadvantage because of our location in Donegal. And it's something really, I suppose, that in my discussions both with your colleague when we went through the Brexit Barometer and in my discussion with you last week, it's not really, I suppose, on the radar at all. The situation of companies like ours in Donegal that are in quite a difficult predicament. We're affected as well by our proximity to the north because a lot of our direct sales in County Donegal are actually being bought by Northern Ireland visitors to the county. So we're very reliant outside of the supply chain as well, of course.
It certainly is an absolutely unique topic that probably most of us haven't considered in the room, but just speaking to you last week on the phone, it was very enlightening, I suppose, just to get a sense of a very, very unique challenge that you're looking to work through. So, I mean, have you done work yourself then in relation to mapping your supply chain?
We've spoken to our hauliers, and I think they're caught in the uncertainty of the entire thing. They know that they can deal with it when it happens, but they don't know how they're going to deal with it until it happens and they know what it is. So I think we've all prepared. We feel that we can overcome the difficulty. It'll cost us money, but we'll survive. It's going to be a difficult situation.
Might bring Philip in here. So we also chatted last week in relation to supply chain. So you're representing the meat industry here today. So obviously, meat, fresh product. There's a unique set of challenges there. We're currently sending 51% of our beef to the UK. So there's obvious challenges.
Well, there are, and maybe I might just make a comment also about preparedness, because it kind of factors into it in some respect. And over the last 3 years, there have been positions taken in the UK, both in Northern Ireland and in mainland Europe, by processors, in some sense to hold on to that market. And always the narrative from Meat Industry Ireland has been that the UK is an important market, and we're going to stay in that market, come hell or high water. That's our principal objective. And that fed into the customer relations piece as well during that period, that we kept in contact, our companies kept in contact with their customers in the UK, as they would have been doing anyway. I don't think there was anything necessarily new about that, but it presumably intensified over that period, particularly around the time when sterling, which had been at 72 in 2016, drove up to 92 at the high water level in 2017, 2018. That became a big issue because it meant that people had to take positions in hedging. They had to try and recover certain losses that resulted from that in the market. And they were difficult conversations that had to be had. But they've come through that period. And the problem, probably principal problem we face now, is not necessarily access to the UK in that market, because we expect that the investment that has been done in Dublin Port will bear fruit, and that we can keep that relatively seamless. The problem we probably have, the greatest problem, is how do we get into our continental suppliers, and what are the risks associated with that? And what we have looked for guarantees on the Dover-Calais route, the land bridge route, which is through which most of our product goes. It's supplied through that Calais port, and there are all sorts of uncertainties about what might happen when this thing is actually activated to a no-deal scenario in October. Both from the UK perspective, will they have the infrastructure to allow relative free flow through that access point? Will they prioritise Irish through supplies over British supplies into that market? Quite unlikely. And how will the French react? How will they deal with the border on the incoming supplies going into that market? So that's going to be a big difficulty. And the biggest challenge has been to get engagement at government level on looking at alternative routes. And we're talking principally about direct from Dublin or Rosslare to Calais or Cherbourg or Ostend or wherever you want to pick, and getting dedicated lines contracted in so that we're ready to deal with the no-Brexit scenario.
You're nodding your head, Larry. This is obviously work that Don Farm Foods has been actively engaged in.
Yeah, right now Ireland Inc.'s flank is a bit exposed on that score. We all know that the immediate risks of Brexit relate to the UK marketplace, and both as a destination for our products and as a source of products for organisations like Musgraves and others. There's a huge risk come the end of October if we don't actually have a solution for the direct European route for both inbound supply of raw material and outbound supply of finished products to continental customers. And it's a risk we don't need to actually even be talking about. We just need to take it off the table from a capacity perspective and facilities perspective. And industry needs to be assured that that will be sorted from day one with capacity in place. Not wait until the first deliveries, the first week or two deliveries are missed and the confidence of continental customers is undermined. That's not a risk we should be taking with customers that took 50 years to build. So it's one that needs to get sorted. It's not sorted yet. I know that MII and others are doing a lot of work on it, and I commend that, and it needs to be escalated. It's a risk we don't even need to be having in the context of Brexit.
Just maybe a comment on that. And while I don't want to minimise at all the risk of the land bridge for the meat industry, it is fundamentally important, and as both Larry and has said, it is, and Philip has said that it has to get sorted without a doubt. One thing we have found, and obviously when you're facing a crisis, there's nothing like a good crisis to have really look at yourself and look at your own business. And in terms of that mapping of the supply chain, we looked at our reliance on the land bridge. It's nowhere near as significant as it would be on the meat side. But we have some land bridge. We do use the land bridge for some consignments for the continent. But we mapped them out and we looked at them. Did we need to do them? Do we need to actually use land bridge? And this may be, if you're not into the sort of the fresh product side and you don't have that very, very, very short delivery time that you have to meet, which is where the land bridge really adds the value. It's certainly worthwhile just, seriously looking at your supply chain, looking at some of those consignments and going, do they need to actually go the land bridge? Could you rechange your processes and your supply chain, your logistics, and maybe, give it an extra day or two, make sure obviously it meets the customer's requirements, but set it off a couple of days earlier. There is that sort of thing that you can certainly look at, and you never know, it might come up one or two surprises for you. There is this classic thing, why do we do this? Well, we've always done it, and so that sort of element of it, and it's certainly worth, it's not a solution, but it's just something that we found that just helped with some minor tidying up, and minor, I really mean minor.
Anna's right. The reality of not using the land bridge to get to continental Europe is that it'll cost you the thick end of €1,000 per truck more and take you 24 hours minimum longer. And frankly, right now, a lot of customers don't have the opportunity to pass that cost on to their end customer, in which case it must be seen as an investment in their future supply chain. On the outbound side, in a business that only generates between 1 and 5% PBT on a good day, that's a tough call. But, you know, just to give you the example, we moved all our European customers' loads and services onto direct routes last November. We just would not risk finding ourselves in a crux capacity-wise come the 11th hour of the 11th day and everybody's clambering and because the ferries don't know us on the routes. So I urge everybody to make their voices heard who has both supply chains in continental Europe or indeed customers in continental Europe, because it will affect your raw material supply chains as much as it will your customer base. It's a really important one. We don't need it on the table in the context of Brexit.
We're talking about fine margins, and we're the finest of margins away from 90p. In terms of financial resilience, potentially putting investments on hold is another topic that we've identified in the Barometer. And you have some interesting thoughts on this in relation to what is perceived to be a threshold.
Well, actually, Tara had the slide on it, and it was a perfect example, and she said it herself that you can see that there is sort of a trend away, that financial resilience is beginning to be built more into the supply chain in terms of the currency. I mean, we've said like Brexit is already happening. The impact of Brexit is already there. You know, I mean, and the first example of it was obviously in terms of the currency piece. You know, so you know, there's consumer confidence, but there's also currency and there's margin erosion, and we're already seeing that is the case, particularly in the context of the UK, and driving that to a large extent is the currency, and we're now at 90p, and you know, looking to the future in terms of treasury and hedging and currency protection, and what you're looking at, and I think at the moment you have to be expecting that it is actually going to get weaker. There's no upside on this at the moment, certainly in the terms of currency, but certainly the industry, we have got more resilient now. I don't want anybody to suggest that we're saying we're complacent on it, because we're not. I mean, it is a huge cost to the industry. You know, rather than trading at 75, we're now at 90, and it looks as if it's going to go higher. But there's certainly the indications from the Barometer is showing that is being built in to some extent in terms of the industry, but at a cost to everyone at the same time as well.
Larry, you described not having a hedging strategy in place as open book punting.
Yeah, it is. I mean, personal view, but practiced experience endorses it. Anybody who isn't proactively using some sort of hedging strategy to manage their currency exposures inside and outside, they're you know, both ways of the supply chain, is, in my opinion, off their rocker. People who talk about 72p currency, that was a bubble, with due respect, and you have to look at where the currency was over a considerable period of time, and you're going to find that the answer is somewhere in the low to mid 80s. And if those opportunities present themselves again, companies should be proactively using that to manage their FX exposures and inflation to their customers, or non-inflation to their customers, as I see Sharon glaring at me there. You know, we got the message earlier. You don't like inflation. So that's really fundamental. And I came back from Europe very late last night, so I was skimming the Irish Times online, and I was shocked to learn, well, not shocked, but amused would be a better way of describing it, about some analysis that the Times had done of a number of people, not in the food industry, Tara, don't get alarmed, although I'm sure there are some in the food industry, where they did a calculation that 50% of the companies spent money and invested in being prepared, and 50% punted and didn't prepared, and they're laughing all the way to the bank because Brexit didn't happen in March. That's horrific, folks. If you're not investing, if we as an industry, in the food industry, the most important indigenous industry that the country has, are not investing and taking the appropriate steps to safeguard our employees, our businesses, our supply chains, and our customers, we are literally off our rocker. And it's really, really important that those that are not engaged in that take an opportunity and become engaged in it. It's not a simple subject, but it's not massively complicated.
Okay.